thanks everybody for coming. I'm really excited to have a great conversation with you.
Mm-hmm. All right, first question. Should we begin? Everyone ready? All right. Yeah, this is a casual conversation, just a starter. Also, we will be interviewing we're recording the whole interview, so this will be up online sometime soon as well. So feel free to share to your friends once the video is up as well. All right, the first question. So, Dr. Saks, first question, we want to start with the general question about poverty, actually, and especially with the invention of the poverty line. We just had the recent visit of the King of Bhutan in Mongolia. And as we all know, the Bhutanese kingdom, they use the gross national happiness index instead of GDP, right? So as far as I know, so once the World War II was finished, the world order was newly set. And in the 1960s, one day, Mongolians, for example, woke up and then we saw ourselves below the poverty line, I believe. So basically, the poverty line itself is a social concept, right? But it doesn't mean that the poverty isn't a real issue also. But however, I was just contemplating that with the visit of the King of Bhutan, I was thinking that how countries like Mongolia can redefine poverty and prosperity.
Great question to start. So it goes to the question: what is our aim in public policy, in politics, in economics? What is well-being? How do you achieve it? Is happiness the right measure? And if so, what does happiness mean? Well, as you know, nobody has solved these issues for thousands of years. The question of what is happiness exactly. So we can say that it is an ongoing question. But one thing is sure, three different concepts we could talk about just from the economic side. One is the gross domestic product, which is how we measure the size of an economy. The second is the poverty line. And the third is well-being or happiness. So these are three different ideas. The idea of the gross national product was an invention that came 100 years ago. After World War I in the United States, the government and some economists asked, how big is our economy? Because when the war came, we didn't even know how much could produce, so we wanted to know the size of the economy. But we didn't have any measures for what is the size of an economy. So a very clever young man named Simon Kuznets in the United States started to devise what we call now gross national product. And I just mentioned his name for two reasons. One, he got a Nobel Prize in economics for his work. And second, I got to know him when I was young, studying, and he was about 80, or he seemed to be 80 at the time. He was an older man, and he invited me to his house every month, and I learned from him. One thing he told me, this is now 50 years ago, he told me the gross national product is not a measure of well-being. So this is a very basic idea. It's a measure of the size of the economy. So you can't say, if the government says we want to grow 7% per year, what does that mean? It means that what we measure as the gross national product or the gross domestic product should rise 7% per year. But that by itself is not a measure of well-being of the people. It's a measure of the size of the economy. Now, when we talk about gross national product or gross domestic product, two words that mean almost the same thing. What's interesting is the size of the economy per person, because if you have 1 billion people like your neighbor next door, then it's going to be a big economy, but the question is, per person will measure something about the living standards in the country. So we talk about the gross national product per capita, or the gross domestic product per capita. And that is very often the reference point for some people to say, is this a rich country or a poor country, or a good economy or a bad economy? But it's really just a measure of the size of the economy. So there's a second concept of poverty. Poverty means, in principle, that the person in poverty or the group in poverty can't achieve their basic needs of some kind. Mm-hmm. So that's the idea of poverty. That's very different from the size of the economy. It asks whether there are people in the economy, in the country, that can't achieve basic needs. What are people's basic needs? Of course, that depends. It depends on historical context. What people would have considered basic needs at the time of Genghis Khan and what people consider basic needs today are different. So the poverty line has to be relative to some concept of the basic needs of a person. This issue came up in 1948 when the United Nations was first established, because the idea was a commission headed by a lady named Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of Franklin Roosevelt, who was the US president who had the idea of the United Nations, said, what are the basic needs for everybody? And that commission established something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is an important document of the UN. But one of the ideas is that people have the rights to meet their basic economic needs. And you can look at that document and say, what are those basic needs? And what the document says is, well, everyone should have the right to enough nutrition to be healthy. Everyone should have the right to get medical care if they need it. Everyone should have the right to go to school. Everyone should have the right to social protection, meaning suppose that their house is in a flood or in some kind of catastrophe, then they would need help. Or suddenly somebody loses their job, or their herds die, or something happens, then they're in desperate need. They would need help. So the idea of the poverty line is trying to get a measure of how much money you need in order to be able to meet your needs. You can see it's a little bit of a difficult concept, because if the government is providing some of the needs, maybe you don't need the money if the healthcare is free, for example, but if you have to pay for the healthcare, then you do need the money. So the idea that there's $1 amount or some unit that defines poverty is arbitrary. Mm-hmm. But in the world system, the World Bank was given the job of defining a poverty line. They have a kind of complicated definition, but it comes to $1.90 per person per day, but measured in a quite funny way, so I won't go into all the details. And then surveys are made, and then how many people in the country are below that number and how many people are above that number is what is called the international poverty line. But then every country has its own standard, and the United States has its own poverty line, which is quite different, which came from a calculation 50 years ago that said, how much does it cost to feed a family of 4 people? And they calculated that, and then they added something, because it's not just food you need shelter, and you need some other things, and then they made a line which is somewhat arbitrary. and that became the poverty line, and then it's adjusted every year. So each country has its own standard. That's a very important concept because of one idea. Generally, if people are deprived of something basic, they're suffering. Mm-hmm. So since this is a Buddhist country, we're trying to stop suffering. Buddha said one thing about stopping suffering, which was avoid desire, but also needing food is real. And one thing that Siddhartha learned, he tried going without anything physical, and he decided that wasn't the way to happiness. And so I believe that too. People need enough food, they need health care, they need water, they need sanitation, they need schooling. So my idea always has been in my own career that we should meet everybody's basic needs at least, because the world is rich enough to do that, and that it's kind of a crime when there's so much wealth that we still have people that are suffering, even not able to have their even a basic healthy food supply each day. Or Sonia and I work a lot in Africa, and there are kids who die from malaria, from a mosquito bite with this disease, but it only costs 80 cents of US dollars to buy the cure, but they don't have enough money for that. But this is absurd, tragic. How can it be that somebody's dying because they don't have 80 cents? Mm-hmm. So I started something 20 years ago called the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, because the idea was, for heaven's sake, let's make sure that nobody is dying because they don't have enough money for treating AIDS or curing TB or treating malaria. So that's the idea of the poverty line, and my idea is that poverty is a really stupid situation in a world that is so wealthy that we could end it if we cared to end it. Mm-hmm. In general, rich people don't necessarily care to end the poverty of poor people. Mm-hmm. So this is an ongoing political struggle. And the United States ideology in our country is people are on their own. Mm-hmm. It's a very individualistic idea. If you're poor, well, tough luck. That's your own fault. If you're rich, oh, cool. You're in good shape. And if you're rich, the rich people in the United States say, we don't have to pay taxes to help the poor people. This is a free country, and nobody's going to take away my money. I don't agree with that at all, that philosophy, but a lot of people do. And Elon Musk, who is, I'm a friend with him, but I don't agree with all of his philosophy. Uh-huh. He just said he is going to give $45 million each month to elect Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So when Donald Trump comes to office again, which he probably will, he will cut the taxes for the rich people. Right. And so we'll have even less help for the poor in the United States. And then the rich people will say, well, the poor, that's their own problem. That's their own fault. Then there's a third idea. So there's the size of the economy, there's the poverty line, and then the third idea is happiness or well-being. Mm-hmm. This is quite different because where does happiness come from? Of course, everybody has their theories of happiness. Buddha's theory of happiness was the middle path and the escape from desire, so that happiness came from unfulfilled desire and from the illusion of ego. This is not at all a U.S. idea because we believe in ego very much. In fact, the whole philosophy is based on ego, based on individual reality. For Buddhism, it's individual illusion. So there are different opinions. My favorite philosopher is Aristotle. And Aristotle was the Greek philosopher who taught many things about happiness. He wrote a great book about happiness called The Ethics. And in Greek, the word for happiness is eudaimonia. That's the ancient Greek word. And it means a thriving, good life. And so Aristotle wrote a whole book, what does it mean to have a thriving, good life? And he said a few interesting things. He said, first of all, try to be moderate in your desires. He didn't say don't have desires, but keep them moderate. So don't try to become super rich, but you don't have to be poor either. He said something that is kind of in the middle between what he called deficiency and extremes.
It's like Sweden.
Yeah, so he said the middle way, so did Buddha in a somewhat different way, but they both called for the middle path. And then Aristotle said, you know, you don't have to be rich, but being poor is no fun. So he said, if you want to be happy, you should have enough material goods to have a decent life. And he was a citizen in Athens 2,300 years ago, where there were many slaves that made citizens like him able to have a higher life, but the slaves were in really much more misery. But the idea was you need a certain level of well-being to be happy. And then he said you need good luck also, because if you have a bad karma, if you get a disease, if you're injured in something, you can be unhappy. And so it's a matter of luck, it's a matter of external goods, he called them, and it's a matter of character. So he had a kind of very interesting balanced view of what happiness is. But the point is, GDP per capita is not happiness. In general, poverty is suffering, so it's not a desirable situation. And the question is, well, what should society aim for? And the fourth king of Bhutan, the father of the king that just visited, in 1971 said, we should aim for happiness. Why are we aiming for GDP? We should aim for happiness. A very nice idea. I worked with the Prime Minister of Bhutan for many years, about 15 years ago, and we make an annual report called the World Happiness Report. And it's quite an interesting thing because one company, the Gallup company, goes around to 150 countries and they ask 1,000 people in each country about how happy you are. And the question is specifically the following question. Suppose that life is like a ladder. So it has 10 rungs on the ladder. The bottom rung, 0, it's the worst life you can imagine. The top rung, the 10th rung, is the best life you can imagine. Where do you stand on the ladder of life? That's the question asked to about 150,000 people around the world. Each country then is given an average, and we report once a year on how countries respond to that. By the way, Bhutan is somewhere in the middle, not so high. The highest countries in the last 10 years have been in Europe, Sweden and Norway. They're quite rich, by the way, in GDP per capita. They also have a lot of social protection. because the government taxes a lot and then it spends a lot so that everybody in those countries has guaranteed health care, guaranteed schools, and so on, what they call the social democratic system. And they like each other because generally these are ethnically homogeneous countries, so that a Norwegian sees another person, that's a Norwegian. And so there's a high level of social trust, not big divisions within the society, and they score very high. The United States is very rich, but it scores much lower because there are a lot more poor people, no one takes care of each other, and they don't like each other very much, by the way, because it's so many different groups, everyone's yelling at each other, even shooting each other, so it's a much more tense situation. So that's the difference of these views, and we're in a big debate right now. What should a society do? But let me tell you about Bhutan. One prime minister ran for office saying this gross national happiness is stupid because we should be richer. And so actually a lot of people said, yeah, we don't like this. This is nice. It sounds nice, but it's not making us happy. We want to be richer. We want to be able to buy more things. We want to be able to travel. We want to have better smartphones. We want, we want bigger houses. And so even within Bhutan, it's not a simple idea. If I can, I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. If you give me one moment, I'm going to try to just find one speech because it's very interesting on this. Hold on.
I can also share the speech later with the audience via email.
Here it is. So probably everybody knows, of course, the President Kennedy in the United States, and people know his brother Robert Kennedy. Yeah. And Robert Kennedy's son is running for president this year, though he's not running in the two main parties, so he won't become president.
I think he got the Secret Service.
Yeah, he got the Secret Service today. Yeah. But he said the following, and I just want to read it because he said it in 1968. Robert Kennedy, the father, I was 14 then. And I loved his father. And Sonia and I went to school with Robert Kennedy Jr., so we know him very well for a long time. But here's what the father said about your question, because it's very beautiful. Right. He said, too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood forest and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic urban sprawl. It counts napalm and counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts the rifles and knives of people who kill other people and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. So it's really an amazing
Beautiful.
statement from
Yeah.
50 years ago. And he was a great man, and they killed him soon after that. So that's also American first.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a great answer. I feel like I'm back in college. It's a great, yeah, awesome. All right.
You asked a professor a question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So you mentioned about Buddhism, right? And as a Buddhist country, I think many of us are Buddhist, but we don't really know what Buddhism and what we preach in Mongolia, which is interesting. But we believe that at least that everything is an illusion. So, but one thing is real, like poverty is real. Poverty for us is bad thief. Poverty is poor education. Poverty is not having an access to electricity or running water in the Gerd district. So, it's bad healthcare and everything. So I was actually listening to a podcast from NPR just the other day with Matthew Desmond on poverty in America. And he said that the biggest barrier to elevating poverty is the belief that poverty is inevitable. Do you think this mindset is shared globally? And but because I do, that we have that mindset in Mongolia, just within the last 30 years of economic transition, it has become our mindset a lot. So and we have a very young audience here as well. How can we challenge and combat that belief?
Well, I think the basic way is, first of all, there are many countries in the world where there is no poverty by any realistic standard, where by the poverty line, nobody's poor, and where by objective measures, everybody has all of their basic needs pretty much assured. And a lot of countries in Europe have been like that, and some countries in other places as well. And then there are places like the United States, which are very rich, but where there's surely a lot of poverty, because it's very individualistic culture and very much protecting the rich people so that they don't have to help the poor people. And I live in New York City, in Manhattan, which is one of the parts of New York City, and we live on the west side of New York City, Manhattan, and if you go to the east side, that's where the richest people in the world live. And it's very interesting. There's a part of the east side of Manhattan from around 96th Street to lower numbers, where there are about 50 billionaires living. That's US dollar billionaires. That's a lot of money. If you have $1 billion, you've got a lot. And it's about 50 such families in a very localized area. If you go above 96th Street, it's incredibly poor people. So there's one street, and below it, it's wealth, and above it, it's poverty. It's not even miles away. It's 5 blocks away. And if you go 5 blocks north, maybe you're more likely to get shot, or because there's more violence, more crime, maybe mugged on the street. And if you go below, very unlikely. Also, the police take a lot more care below 96th Street than they do above 96th Street. So this is, for me, daily reality. A country so divided that it's even divided at 1 block between up and down. And you can find that in other places. In Brazil, sometimes you can see a map of Rio de Janeiro or of Sao Paulo, and you can even tell, looking from the airplane or the drone picture, this side's slums, this side's rich, just like that. So a lot depends on how the society is organized. And this has been a very big debate in the economics profession for 200 years. Of course, there have been different views. One view is the best thing you can do is just leave everyone alone and let them do the best they can, and that creates the most effort and ultimately the most wealth, and ultimately everyone's the best off that way. That's the free market view. And that is an idea that was developed in Great Britain by Adam Smith, who was the founder of British economics, which became US economics. Then, of course, there was Karl Marx's idea, which is that, of course, the rich will always assert their wealth, and the poor will be stuck until they revolt and have a revolution. Well, that was another view that obviously played a major role in this part of the world. And then a third view, kind of a middle path, is that there should be more of a social obligation, so that you give freedom to people to make their businesses or make their decisions, but you don't just leave them alone and tell them you don't have any responsibility. You tax the rich people a lot, and that is what's used by government to help the poor. And that idea is social democracy. In my experience, it's the most successful of all the approaches. So for the last 50 years, I've been a social democrat in my own politics, meaning that I like a fairly sizable government that takes on a lot of responsibility for the health care or the nutrition or the physical infrastructure or the social housing. But I don't like complete central planning, where, like Mongolia had during the Soviet period, where everything is owned by the state and you depend everything on the state. And I don't like the American system, which says government is bad and we should just leave everything to the private economy. So just like Aristotle or maybe Buddha, I'm for the middle path of somewhere between these two extremes. But in my opinion, there's nothing inevitable about poverty. I wrote a book in 2005 called The End of Poverty, and I said by now we could end poverty. Of course, the book didn't achieve the end of poverty, but I don't apologize for what I said, because I said it's not automatic. We have to make the effort. And some countries, your neighbor to the south, China, really did end extreme poverty. I don't think that's just a slogan or propaganda. I think that's real. Because I've been all over China. I haven't seen everything, but I've seen a lot of China. And I was once taken, even 8 years ago, to a place we were told was the poorest county in China, in Ningxia Autonomous Region. And we went to the countryside because it was rural, and it was very poor. But when Sonia and I visited, you were with me on that trip, right? Yeah. And we went, and the woman was with the antenna? Yeah. So we went, you know, when you go to Africa and you see rural poverty, you see places that have nothing. By nothing, I mean, maybe there's a thatched roof. It's not a ger because it's not mobile. But very poor farmers, and no electricity, no running water, no sanitation, and so on. But here, when we went to the poorest place in China, every home had a television set in it. Oh my God, that's like wealth in parts of rural Africa. And so it was, that was the poorest place. So I think that it showed that from 1980 to 2020, which was the big boom period for China, there was an incredible amount of economic advancement, not only GDP per capita, but also ending extreme poverty.
All right, thank you. I was just to delve into your question. Thank you, everyone. So just a quick reminder that we will do have a Q&A section at the end. So if you do have a question, please have to in mind.
Or comments, by the way, not just questions.
Of course. So you talked about China. I did study development back in the States, and they did show us that they actually have very community-based solutions over there. So like, for example, like the Billion Trees Initiative, the organizations don't plant one tree in another place because each place has their own unique, soil, for example. So, when the global sees us, like sees Mongolia, many of the narratives that we have is we are nomads, we are the democracy between the two autocratic nations, etc. But also there's very much deficit-based stuff as well. Like we are not that progressive yet. Some people still believe that we ride horses and don't use the real toilet, for example. But however, that deficit-based approach to development has been very much trying to push us back. But I understood that asset-based look of communities, for example, looking at communities' strengths and the assets that they have is very unique, but it's different for each community. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about how there is a segregation in the US, for example, and that's very similar here in Ulaanbaatar, for example. You just pass the street, and on one side you have the Ger district, and the other side you have the city, the central part of the city, But in Ger district, we have so many assets because of climate change, many migrants are coming from, internal migrants coming from different sides of the country. They are building Gers, they're building houses, and they're living there. And they're actually having a barter economy, microeconomies, they're helping each other out. So there's lots of assets over there as well. So how do you think that we can actually leverage those assets in Mongolia in their own communities, especially as young people?
Well, I'd like you to tell me because you're the experts, not me. So I'd like to hear your ideas. But you're raising a good question about what are assets? What does it even mean to say community assets or individual assets? So let me just say a word about that. We use in economics the word assets or capital to mean things that are productive, somehow things that produce goods and services that are useful for people or that raise well-being or that reduce poverty. So what kinds of capital or assets are there? Because these assets come in many different shapes and forms. So one kind of asset that is probably the most important of all is what we call human capital or human assets. And human capital is defined in economics as the health, the skills, the productivity, the knowledge of a person or a group of people. And education plays a large role in that. Of course, the transmission of knowledge from parents to children play a large role in that. Nutrition plays a large role in that because physically you need nutrition in order to be healthy. Healthcare plays a large role in human capital. But from an economic point of view, if you compare different societies and you ask about well-being or about gross domestic product per person, either way, you'll find that the human capital is the number one determinant in our world today. Maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago, education wasn't so central because people were living on farms or were herders, and education may or may not have played much of a role. And in fact, in most of the world, most people never got any formal education, or maybe a year or two, but not long term. Now, education is absolutely central. So that's one kind of asset. Another kind of asset is what we call infrastructure. So that, of course, are all the connective parts of the economy, generally provided by government, but not always. It includes electricity, it includes the digital access, so whatever kind of fiber for access to the internet or to mobile phones. It includes the roads, it includes the rail, it includes the water systems, it includes the heating systems for UB, and so on, the physical infrastructure. Sometimes the housing is put into that category also. So that's a second kind of asset. A third kind of asset is all the business capital that private businesses have invested in the factories, in the machinery, in their transport equipment, in their mining equipment, and so forth. So that's a third kind. A fourth kind of capital is the natural capital, the physical environmental capital. Your pasture lands are natural capital. Like any kind of capital, they can be worn out. So if there are too many goats grazing, as is true here apparently, I'm no expert on herding, but if it's true, then you deplete your natural capital. Or if you're a coastal economy and you have fish in the coastal regions and you overfish them, you deplete the natural capital. Your copper mines and so forth are part of the natural capital, but depletable. The more you take out, the less will remain there. Biodiversity is part of the natural capital because the ability of all of us as biological species to stay alive depends on all the other species too. And if we kill off the other species, we kill off ourselves as well because our food won't grow. It won't be pollinated. Literally, we won't be able to survive. Another kind of capital, which is the kind you mentioned, is social capital. What is social capital? Social capital is not owned by any individual or by a business or by a government. It's a measure of the trust within a society. So do people trust each other? Do they cooperate with each other? Or do they shoot each other? So in the United States, we have very low social capital. One of the reasons is that the U.S. is so diverse ethnically and racially and religiously. Nobody trusts each other, likes each other, or understands each other very much. Second, our political system was based on that, which is just leave me alone. Don't make me like my neighbor. I came from this region of Europe, you came from this region. We don't necessarily have to have anything to do with each other. So it's a different kind of society. It's not built on the social bonding. America was a little bit different. And then a third part about America is the way that it developed is that it was a conquest society. So what do I mean by that? In the year 1491, before Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain to the Caribbean islands, and then Europe discovered that there was this big continent that they didn't know about beforehand. There were, of course, many native populations. They were related to Mongolian people, to people of East Asia, who crossed over to the Americas around 15,000 years ago, when the ice sheet was very large, and therefore the ocean level was much lower. There was a land connection, of course, between Asia and North America where you could migrate. And people migrated, and that is what we call the Native American populations. And Christopher Columbus called them the Indians because he thought he was in India. He didn't realize where he was. But in any event, when the British came, they thought, well, this is our continent now. So who are all these people here? They have no right to be here, thought the British. And over the course of about 300 years, they exterminated a lot of the native peoples, or they pushed them into kind of concentration camps or Indian reservations. A very cruel, racist process. But then the United States settlers, or the British settlers, said, well, who's going to farm all these farms, especially for growing sugar and tobacco and cotton? Oh, we need slaves. And so they imported millions of African slaves captured in Africa, brought to the Americas. So the United States became a very racially segregated society. White people on top, American Indians driven to extinction, and African slaves at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And this is one of the reasons also why the society is so unequal, because it's got these big racial divisions as well. So that means a very low level of social capital across the society. If you tell me there's lots of social capital here in the herder communities, for example, wonderful. That's a great strength for your society. My own guess, though, is that the children in herder groups should get a very good education, for sure, because that's their empowerment, whether they continue to be herders in the next generation or not. Their empowerment is education now, because that will give them also the capacities, the technology, the choice, and so on. And I think that that's very important. But keeping the social capital is one of the hallmarks of a successful society. And it should usually lead to lower levels of violence and a more peaceful community as well. Whereas in the US, we have a lot of violence that is a result of all of this inequality and lack of social trust.
Thank you very much. So next question, you mentioned about natural capital, and in Mongolia we had a very bad dzot this year, which is a disastrous winter event, and this is all due to climate change, as I mentioned before. As we all know, Mongolia is one of the least polluters in the world, but we're hit hardest in the world as well. And the climate change is really real here in Mongolia. Global Green Growth Institute did a study in Mongolia recently, just a couple of months ago. And what they found was that in Mongolia, young people know about climate change, but they don't care. But the older generations, they don't know what climate change is, what global warming is, but they are very much concerned by it. But my personal belief is that they are affected by it. Yeah. And you mentioned that social democracy is something that you advocate for. Just to paraphrase, we are now the government is the continuation of social democratic government, and yet they introduced a very progressive ideas. Now we have a ministry on climate change as well, which is very new in Mongolia. But that actually shows that government is actually now taking serious at government level and president's level as well. We have the Billion Trees Initiative. We have COP17 coming up as well. So climate change in Mongolia is real. It's affecting us, but young people are not really much caring about it. But how do you think climate change is actually affecting the poverty all over the world? And we believe that climate change in Mongolia, what's most important is climate resilience, because we have to adapt really quick. So what do you think Mongolian young people and the communities can do to adapt to this new environment?
Let me say two basic things. One, a general point, and then one about Mongolia specifically. This climate change is very real, it's global, it's very serious, and it's happening very fast now. So this is one point. Second, the challenge for Mongolia will be very distinctive for this country. we don't have herders in the United States except a tiny amount.
Right.
But for you, that's a very important part of the society. Mongolians will be the only ones that will care enough and that need to understand all of this scientifically. So you can't wait for a study from the Green Growth Institute or from the World Bank or from Columbia University or from any place else. You had better do your homework, really your scientific homework, to understand what this means for this country. If any of you are scientifically inclined, it's a really important area to work in, and your country needs you. So there needs to be a really good understanding.
That gave me goosebumps.
For here.
Gave me goosebumps.
Yeah, because no one else is ever going to know as much as you need to know to address this challenge here. You're going to be the experts on the grasslands. You're going to be the experts on how temperature, water circulation, river flow, soil moisture, health of the livestock, all of that is going to be impacted. If you ask me, what does global warming mean for your cashmere production or for the goat population? I have no idea. And by the way, I could look it up and read some study or ask Perplexity right now.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do that. But honestly, if you really want to know the answer, you better figure that out. Okay? And it's not a simple answer. You need to go put monitors of across the country. You need to look at rainfall patterns. You need to be able to study geographic information system data. You need to be able to do climate modeling. You need to be able to be in scientific exchanges with the leading climatologists. You need to be able to invite climatologists here, but not to get an answer for them, but to have discussions with them about your own models, how you're doing, what you're finding, what you're learning, and so on. And this is what I say to every place in the world, because we visit a lot of places each year. Every single place we go, every single place has a climate crisis right now. But in some places it's floods, in other places it's droughts. In South America it's a dengue fever outbreak. That's also happening in Bangladesh because warmer temperatures, more mosquitoes, more transmitted disease. So everybody experiences this in a different way. In the Caribbean, it's more powerful typhoons. So how is it going to affect you? Probably in many different ways. But how? Nobody knows for sure. And the more you study it, the more you're going to get the basic answers. What I was told, by the way, just to tell you, I led an institute at my university, at Columbia University, for 15 years called the Earth Institute. And the idea was have some climate scientists, some energy experts, some engineers, a few economists, and some other professions all working together to try to understand these issues. So I had, as colleagues, hundreds of climate scientists, some of the best in the world. They're really scary because they know a lot, and what they tell you is not very comforting. They say the world is really being disturbed by the human action in ways that are not experienced during the last 10,000 years. So everything we built up is changing now. All our agriculture is now facing a different weather pattern from the weather pattern that is the whole basis of all our agricultural production. And this is accelerating. And my leading climate colleague is a man named James Hansen, and he was the chief climate scientist for the US government for 30 years, for NASA, for the space agency. So he put up satellites to measure how the climate's changing and very, very sophisticated things. And he has told me for 20 years that the human-made climate change is happening faster than even the official reports, because the official reports are not at the cutting edge of science. They're kind of 5 years behind the real cutting edge knowledge. And so he's been telling me all along, it's worse than you hear. And he's been right, because then the consensus ideas 5 years later say what Jim Hansen said 5 years earlier. So what he's telling me now is that the Earth is warming at a faster rate, twice as fast approximately as it was warming during the last 40 years. During the last 40 years, the rate of warming was about 0.18 degrees Celsius every decade. Now it's about 0.3 or higher every decade. So this means that all our nice targets, 1.5 degrees limit and so forth, we won't achieve any of that. The temperature will rise above the limits that we set, and the consequences will be very significant, very serious. And we're going to need two things. One, like you said, resilience. What to do? How to protect the herds, for example, in a bad winter. It's not just passive, there are active things that can be done with foraging or protection of the herds or so forth, and those investments should be made. The second thing is we have to speed the energy change from coal to wind, from coal or gas to sunshine, or to other safer energy. For Mongolia, that's a big deal, because you're a coal-producing, coal-exporting country. And in 20 years, you will not be exporting coal. I guarantee it. Because China will not be buying your coal.
Right.
Because they will not want it. And when you ship, and one good thing for this country is you have lots of wind power. Much, 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 much more than you could ever need for the 3.5 million people of Mongolia. You could export a lot of electricity. You're buying electricity from Russia right now.
Yeah.
No need. You could produce all the electricity and more and make a big profit from it by producing it and exporting it to China. And by the way, Inner Mongolia is producing a lot of wind power because China needs it. And China will need your wind power too, so it's a good business. But also, I haven't been here in the winter in a long time, but I'm told it's quite polluted in the winter because of people burning coal and all the normal pollutants from that. 20 years from now, the air will be clean here because you'll be running on clean wind power rather than on dirty coal. So that's good. It will probably add a year or two of life expectancy also. I'm just guessing because I haven't done the actual numbers, but life expectancy in Mongolia is 71 years right now on the international data. I don't know if it's up to date or not. You know, in Japan, it's about 86 years. So you could catch up a lot in health. And one of the biggest health factors here is a lot of air pollution, which is surprising because you have the eternal blue sky. So it shouldn't be a polluted country, but coal has made the air pollution for the half the population that lives in UB very bad in the winter months, I'm told. So this is something that could be cleaned up a lot. So the bottom line is next time I come here, I want a detailed report from you guys about what climate means for this country and what you're going to do about it. And we should understand that this is going to change the economy here as well. And that means that the government and you, the young people, need a strategy for this country to move to the post-coal economy. And that should be a smart strategy. I think it will be a lot connected with China because China will be your major market for your clean energy, but it's something that needs to be worked out.
Do you think China will be buying copper in 20 years from us?
Copper, yes, because copper is for the clean energy system as well as the current energy system. So there's going to be lots of long distance transmission of electricity, for example.
Right.
You need copper for that.
Yeah.
Copper is going to be for the new electrification because the whole world's energy system is going to move much more to electricity. We'll heat our houses with electricity. We'll run our cars with electricity. We will produce manufactured goods much more with electricity. The mining equipment will be electrified rather than diesel. So there'll be a lot more electricity. Copper goes along well with that.
Great. I think this is going to be probably my last question, and then I will open up for the Q&A or comment section. Another global question, but more about global conflicts. So you mentioned about that we do buy our energy or gas from Russia. I recently visited Ukraine and I met with the President Zelensky, and I told him that people of Mongolia stand with you. What I meant was that we stand for peace, we stand for diplomatic solutions, for example. And about that time, we actually had energy cut in Mongolia. So we actually received lots of death threats from pro-Russian Mongolians for saying that to the president. But the question is, you advocate for diplomatic solutions and neutrality in global conflicts. And I believe as a young people, global neutrality, conflict neutrality, Mongolia itself is a very neutral country between Russia and China. But we do want diplomatic solutions. I met with many Ukrainians. They do want diplomatic solutions. However, they want the complete withdrawal of Russia first. Could you explain why this is important, the diplomatic solutions instead of using conflicts, and how people like us, young people, can advocate for it?
Great, thank you, thanks a lot. So the Ukraine war is a very dangerous and very destructive war, of course, and hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and every day there's an incredible amount of violence. And every day there's a risk that the war will actually escalate as well into even more deadly conflict. And there's a lot of debate about why this war is happening and where it came from. And in Mongolia, it would be logical to say, well, we sympathize with Ukraine because it's been attacked by Russia, and we don't like big countries attacking small countries. And this is a threat not only to Ukraine, but it's a threat to Mongolia. And that would make a lot of sense. But I see the war in a different way because I see it from the US Russia perspective. And I see it as a war that is really a war between the US and Russia that happens to be fought in Ukraine, for Ukraine. It is sometimes the word is proxy war, but it's actually not even a proxy war, it's a direct war. It's a direct war that, thank God, has stayed non-nuclear, but it is really a direct war because Americans are in Ukraine. They program in where the missiles are going to be fired because it's American missile systems. They use American satellites, they use American drones, they choose the location, and then a Ukrainian presses the button at the end and launches the missile, but I would say that's a US attack on Russia, and that's how the Russians view it as well. So to my mind, this is a war between the US and Russia. And it's a war that never should have happened. But it came, in my opinion, by the way, most Americans don't agree with me, but it came, in my opinion, because the United States was too arrogant in its behavior and didn't give respect to Russia. And for me, it goes back 35 years, because in 1989 and 1990, I was an advisor to the government of Poland. After 1989, when the revolution came in Eastern Europe to end the Soviet rule. Mm-hmm. So I was there close up, and I got to know President Gorbachev, and of course I listened to President Gorbachev, and for me, he was really a great, great man. The Soviet people really hated him. Many of them, because the inflation was rising, the economy was going down, they thought he's ruining everything. But for me, he was a great man because he was a man of peace. And this was his main point. We don't want a Cold War anymore. We need to fix our own system, and we don't want a confrontation with the United States anymore. And I thought, oh, bless you. This is wonderful, because we need a man of peace. Mm-hmm. So he said, let's have peace. And this was 1990. And the German chancellor at the time, named Helmut Kohl, said, okay, now we want to reunify Germany, East and West Germany, because East Germany was under the Soviet system, West Germany was under the US-led system. And the German chancellor said, we reunify. And since Gorbachev was a man of peace, he said, yes, that's fine. But don't take advantage of us. You know, we don't want to make war with you, but we don't want you, the Western world, to take advantage of us. Mm-hmm. And so on February 7th, 1990, our Secretary of State, named James Baker III, said to Gorbachev, okay, NATO, our military alliance, will not move 1 inch eastward.
Right.
And Gorbachev said, that's very important, thank you. Mm-hmm. And then Gorbachev actually asked me to be part of his economic team, so I tried to help for a year. But the help that I tried to offer was, I said that the United States should help the Soviet Union to rebuild its economy. And my colleagues and I made a proposal to the US government. I said, give $30 billion this year to the Soviet Union to help rebuild. And the White House said, hell no, they're the enemy. Why should we give them any money? And so the whole idea that I had was completely rejected. And of course, Gorbachev then was kidnapped in August 1991. It was an attempt to overthrow him. And in effect, it brought the end of the Soviet Union, because Boris Yeltsin rose to power in Russia, mm-hmm. and Yeltsin said, we want independence, we want to end the Soviet Union. And Boris Yeltsin's team asked me to be their advisor, and so I tried also the same way to get US help. Mm-hmm. Again, no help given, but I was in the Kremlin in December 1991 when the Soviet Union ended, literally that day. With Boris Yeltsin. So it was very interesting.
Interesting.
So when the Soviet Union ended, the United States said, okay, we're the last superpower in the world. We won. Now this is a very interesting idea, because Gorbachev's idea was no winners, we just make peace. But the US mentality is, we won, you lost, we run the show now. And the first thing they started to do was to expand NATO. Ah, but you told us you wouldn't. Ah, but that was the Soviet Union. We can do what we want. We're now the sole superpower. So to my mind, the US became very arrogant. And the approach of the US government was, we are the only superpower in the world. No one can challenge us. Russia is weak. In fact, Obama made a really obnoxious statement once that said, what is Russia? Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. In other words, it's got oil and gas and nuclear weapons. What a nasty, stupid thing to say about another country. But that was the arrogant American attitude. So there was no respect. In my belief, always show respect to the other. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't respect them, show respect. You know, it's the proper way to behave. Mm-hmm. It's even better if you really respect the other side, of course. And the US showed not only no respect, it kept bragging. We had a Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, whom Sonia and I knew, and we did not like her because she was an arrogant person. But she said, we are the indispensable country. Well, what do you mean, the indispensable country? You're only 4% of the world population. How can you be indispensable? What about the other 96%? Are they indispensable? I would say yes. But the American attitude was very arrogant. Mm-hmm. So this is my approach, that the US aimed to take advantage of the Russian weakness. I could go on for hours about what happened, but what basically happened, is that the US kept saying, we'll put our military bases closer and closer to Russia. And the President Putin kept saying, stop, don't go farther. And the US said, who cares what you say? We can do what we want. And we kept going farther. And this first started with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And then the next wave, that was 1999, and then in 2004 were the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia, 7 more countries. Then Putin said in 2007, don't go any farther. Stop. You're threatening us. We don't want you on our border. And so the next year, George Bush Jr. said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. And the European leaders were very much against it. They said, George, this is dangerous. They have nuclear weapons. They don't want this. And George Bush said, we are America. They can't tell us what to do. We can do what we want. We are the strong alliance. They're the weak alliance. Well, even then, things didn't exactly go to war, but in 2010, Ukraine elected a president named Yanukovych who said we should be neutral. He was smart. He said neutral for 2 reasons. One, he came from the Russian-speaking region, so he wanted closer relations with Russia. But also he knew it would be dangerous for Ukraine. So then he was thrown out of power in February 2014 in a coup. And there's a big debate about what happened. Was this a popular uprising by the Ukrainian people, or was this a regime change operation by the US government? Well, I think it was a lot of both, actually. A regime change operation means that the US CIA uses its secret influence in the media, in the politicians, in armaments, to do something that it says, oh, we don't have anything to do with it, but it does it anyway. And that's how the CIA works. So I saw some of it pretty close up, and I thought, this is a U.S. government operation. This isn't just Ukrainians rising in revolt. This has a strong fingerprint of the United States in it, because I've come to know what that looks like from experience. So my view is the U.S. overthrew or helped to overthrow the government, and that's when the war started, because then President Putin said, well, we're not going to allow our naval base in Crimea to fall into NATO hands just because the U.S. overthrew a government, so we take Crimea back. And then the U.S. said, oh, you see, he's an imperialist. And the Russians said, imperialist, you're the one coming here. No, it's unprovoked, it's your fault. And so that became a propaganda war. The favorite word in the United States is unprovoked. So in the US media, every day we read that President Putin is a little bit crazy and he believes that he's Peter the Great and that he's reestablishing the Russian Empire. To my experience, he is very logical, very rational, very tough, and he is not in an illusion. He sees himself as fighting against the US, which is encroaching on Russian security. So just to bring the story to a more recent time, in 2021, President Putin said, we don't want NATO in Ukraine. By the way, NATO means US. It doesn't mean some organization, it means US military bases, US missiles, US CIA, it means all of that. So the Russians said, we don't want you here. And they put on the table a treaty. Let's negotiate this treaty. So I called the White House then and said, you should negotiate because we don't want a wider war. And I was told, no, we don't have to negotiate. There won't be a war, it's okay. And I said, but stop NATO enlargement because that's what's provoking this. No, NATO can go anywhere it wants. I said, that's not really a good idea. Because I said, suppose that Russia wants to build a military base in Mexico. Would you accept that? Oh, the Americans would go crazy. They would invade Mexico immediately. What if China wanted to build a military base on the Rio Grande River, which separates Mexico and the US, because the Mexicans said we were afraid of the North Americans. The US would invade Mexico. So I said, think about it from Russia's perspective. They don't want you there, so negotiate. Well, they refused to negotiate. And then President Putin launched this escalation, which they called the special military operation. Then in March, just days after that escalation started, Zelensky said, okay, we can be neutral. And they started to negotiate a new peace. And then the United States stopped the negotiations because they said to Zelensky, no, you don't have to be neutral. We have your back. We'll protect you. Don't worry. We're going to send you missile systems. We're going to degrade the Russian economy. We're going to put on sanctions and so forth. And of course, it was an illusion because the US could not save Ukraine.
Right. Ukraine's
right next to Russia. Okay, let me give a suggestion to all of you. Don't join NATO. Mongolia. You have two neighbors that would not like Mongolia to join NATO. And if Mongolia said, well, but we don't like our neighbors, we're afraid of them. And by the way, it's our right to join NATO. That would be the end of Mongolia, would be my prediction. And so my prediction is that if you want to be safe and to survive and to have sovereignty, the first thing you would say is, please don't come anywhere close to here. Don't give us any weapons. Don't give us any this. Don't promise us security. we have two big neighbors, we want good relations with them, we don't want you anywhere here for our security. That's my own opinion. Now, one final thing I may add. Taiwan. Taiwan is another very sensitive, by the way, what I just said, the US government rejects every word I just said. But they're wrong and I'm right. So that's my own opinion. But when it comes to Taiwan, it's very similar. You may say, why should China threaten Taiwan? But my opinion's a little bit different, which is what is the biggest safety for Taiwan? It is to say to the United States, thank you very much, but please stay away. We'll deal with this across the Taiwan Straits ourselves. But the US attitude is, we will arm you so much that China can't invade you. Are you kidding? Taiwan is 24 million people. China is 1.4 billion people. China is a nuclear superpower. China has the world's largest economy in the world. How could Taiwan, no matter what the United States send them, defend itself in a war? It's the whole idea is stupid. So the best way is diplomacy. No fight, no war, talk. China does not want to ruin its complete international place in the world by having a war. But I'll tell you one thing, China does not want Taiwan to declare independence either. Because China's main mindset right now is don't let America break us apart. So their whole mindset is don't allow separatism to take hold. You gained your independence 100 years ago from the Qing dynasty. Good for you. You're not part of that discussion.
Yeah.
But those that are in the PRC or that are in China today better be careful, because China's main concern is not, in my opinion, repressing different groups. That's not what China wants to do, but what China does want to do is prevent separatism from within, because China went through 150 years of vulnerability to European and US and Japanese imperialism, and it doesn't want to be weak in that way again. So it doesn't want the Japanese to interfere, it doesn't want the Americans to interfere, it doesn't want the British to interfere, it doesn't want the separatism. And so as long as there's not the separatism, I think there can be the very good relations. That's my own opinion.
Thank you so much, Professor Sacks. It's been great. Thank you so much for your insightful answers so far. So we do have some limited time.
Sorry I give long answers, but I think that they're very important for accuracy.
No, they were great. Again, it was been a great pleasure. So let's open up the floor for questions or comments. So because we have some limited time, please try to keep your questions very concise. Okay, over there. She's been...
Hi. I'm not sure if everyone can hear me, so I'll try to speak up.